What if the first sound you hear before dawn isn't your alarm clock, but a helicopter circling low floodlights, cutting through your curtains, and the crash of steel doors ripped from their frames? What if your street suddenly looks more like Fallujah than the South Shore of Chicago? That was the reality for hundreds of residents when federal agents descended before sunrise, an operation that would change the tone of America's war on organized crime. At exactly 4:32 a.m., neighbors reported the first explosions, flashbangs, and breaching charges echoing through apartment blocks once home to working families. Within minutes, tactical convoys rolled in. ICE, the FBI Border Patrol, and ATF, over 300 federal agents in full combat gear surrounded the 5-story complex. Some rappelled from helicopters onto the roof, others advanced through side alleys. To those watching from their windows, it looked like the start of a military invasion, not a law enforcement raid. By dawn, 37 suspects had been detained. Residents filmed as women in pajamas and children clung to their parents lined up in zip ties under blinding lights. Local journalists later described the raid as surgical chaos. DHS officials confirmed the operation was aimed at capturing members of Tren de Aragua, a violent Venezuelan transnational gang spreading across the US. But the official briefings left out one detail: federal agencies had spent 7 months mapping this single block. Intelligence suggested gang members had fortified apartments, turning them into micro-strongholds, safe houses wired for lookouts and escape routes. From a tactical perspective, it was a clean hit. Not a single agent injured, not a single shot fired. But the real explosion wasn't from grenades, it was the silence afterward. DHS refused to disclose the names, the charges, or even confirm how many of those taken were verified gang members. Chicago's mayor called for transparency. DHS declined comment. Strategically, the message was unmistakable. Under President Trump's renewed executive mandate classifying cartel-linked gangs as terrorist entities, U.S. law enforcement was no longer operating as mere police. They were conducting counter-terror operations on domestic soil. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly noted the tactics mirrored urban counterinsurgency doctrine once used in Iraq: overwhelming force, rapid dominance, and complete psychological control. To the outside world, it was a symbol of American resolve, proof that Washington's anti-cartel strategy had entered a new phase. But critics from The Guardian and DW questioned whether the militarization of police operations blurred the line between defending citizens and intimidating them. The echoes of such debates resonate far beyond Chicago, from the Russian bombardments of Kharkiv to Israeli raids in Rafah and China's security sweeps in Xinjiang. The struggle between national security and personal liberty defines modern governance. Chicago became the latest front line in that global moral dilemma. As dawn broke over Lake Michigan, residents stood on cracked sidewalks, filming the aftermath: walls punctured by breaching saws, apartments left in ruin. A child's bicycle lay beside a pile of shell casings. The message was clear: the government could strike anywhere at any time in the name of safety. But how much freedom can a society sacrifice in pursuit of security before it becomes its own occupier? Before the sun cleared the horizon, Chicago's South Shore was unrecognizable streets sealed off by armored vehicles, air thick with the smell of gunpowder residue, and the low thrum of helicopter blades fading into the dawn. To the untrained eye, it looked like the aftermath of a battlefield, but to federal commanders, it was the blueprint of a new domestic war. Agents described the operation as a textbook breach. Drone reconnaissance had mapped every exit, every stairwell, and even the thermal signatures of suspected occupants. Tactical teams, each from different federal branches, moved in synchronized waves. ICE executed entry border patrol, covered the perimeter, the FBI handled signals, intelligence and ATF agents monitored explosives risk. Every motion had been rehearsed for days inside a closed facility west of Chicago, according to Defense News. When the doors finally came down, residents inside screamed. Some were dragged from their beds, others forced to the ground at gunpoint. One witness told Reuters it felt like Baghdad during a sweep. Videos circulating online showed officers pulling people many barefoot into floodlit parking lots. For those watching from balconies, it was chaos. For those leading it, it was a controlled storm. DHS later confirmed that 37 individuals were detained, though they refused to release charges or citizenship data. Reporters from The Guardian pressed for transparency, but officials cited operational sensitivity. That silence fueled growing suspicion across the city. Were the agents targeting verified gang members, or simply sweeping up everyone inside? According to internal briefings reviewed by Al Jazeera, the real danger wasn't what agents found, but what they expected to find. Intelligence hinted that Tren de Aragua had stashed military military-grade firearms inside the complex, including modified AR-15 rifles trafficked from Texas. Agents had also intercepted chatter suggesting gang members were authorized to shoot first. To prevent that, the operation relied on overwhelming shock. Fast and Final One ATF supervisor told BBC News, "No negotiation, no standoff." Analysts compared the raid's execution to U.S. counter-narcotics missions in Colombia during the early 2000s, swift, overpowering, and symbolic. Yet the contrast couldn't be sharper. This was not a jungle camp thousands of miles away. This was American soil a few miles from Navy Pier. The raid also revealed a disturbing pattern repeating globally. In Ukraine, Russian and Ukrainian forces have both perfected urban siege tactics that overwhelm opponents through speed and saturation. In Israel, counter-terror raids in Gaza follow similar doctrines: breach, clear, dominate. And in China, internal security forces deploy control saturation in volatile provinces, subduing unrest through omnipresent surveillance and force. The US had now adopted a domestic variant of this doctrine, one that treats criminal networks not as gangs, but as insurgencies. As the smoke lifted, Chicago residents wandered through hallways riddled with splintered wood and broken glass. A mother of 3 told DW they came like soldiers. "My children will never sleep the same again." Another man shouted to reporters, "We're citizens, not enemies." His words echoed across the fractured city, summing up America's growing dilemma. How far should the state go to protect its people from those who hide among them? No shots fired, no agents lost, and yet no answers given. The question lingered in the humid Chicago air: if this was victory, what does defeat look like? As investigators combed through the wreckage of the South Shore complex, a darker truth emerged. This was never just about a single building. It was about a network, a shadow web stretching from Venezuela to Miami, from Mexico's Sonora Desert to Chicago's cold streets. The name whispered through the briefings was Tren de Aragua, a criminal empire born in Venezuelan prisons, now operating like a multinational corporation of violence. Federal intelligence had been tracking the gang for years. According to Reuters and Jane's Defense Weekly, Tren de Aragua evolved from a local extortion crew into a transnational machine, controlling drug pipelines, human trafficking routes, and weapons shipments across Latin America. What makes them different isn't just brutality, it's discipline, command structures, military-style ranks, doctrines borrowed from guerrilla warfare. Inside the US, they behave less like gangsters and more like a paramilitary force. By 2024, analysts from BBC and Al Jazeera were warning that the gang's infiltration of American cities could rival that of the Mexican cartels in scope. From New York to Houston, ICE and FBI operations uncovered safe houses that looked more like forward operating bases, complete with encrypted radio surveillance systems and caches of forged documents. Chicago was the latest dot on a growing map of infiltration. In South Shore, agents believed they had found a regional headquarters. Sources close to DHS described apartments used for coordinating movement of people and weapons. Nearby warehouses served as logistical hubs where vehicles were stripped and refitted for smuggling. A single apartment in the complex contained ledgers tracking cash flow exceeding $2.7 million in just 3 months, evidence of a lucrative transnational network. President Trump's administration quickly seized on the moment. Standing before reporters in Washington, he declared that America will not allow terrorist organizations disguised as gangs to infest our cities. Under an executive order renewed in early 2025, cartel-linked gangs like Tren de Aragua are now treated under counterterrorism jurisdiction, granting DHS broader authority to deploy federal strike units without local approval. Strategically, that shift aligns with what Defense News called the internalization of counter-terror warfare, the blurring of lines between domestic policing and global security operations. The same tools once used to hunt insurgents in Fallujah or Marja are now deployed in American neighborhoods. Globally, the parallels are unsettling. In Ukraine, Russia's Wagner-style mercenary networks once operated under deniable state patronage, just as Venezuelan officials are accused by the guardian of shielding Tren de Aragua leaders. In Iran, the Revolutionary Guard's extraterritorial branches have used civilian infrastructure as cover, echoing how TDA embeds within housing projects. In China, the state's crackdown on underground crime syndicates blurs into political control. The pattern is global organized crime, paramilitary tactics, and political theater merge into one. But for Chicago's residents, such analysis means little. To them, this war is not geopolitical, it's personal. Families now displaced, buildings half demolished, children asking why their walls have bullet holes when no shots were fired. Local activists demand to know who among the detained were truly violent offenders and who were simply undocumented migrants in the wrong place. Community leaders from South Shore church groups told DW they fear retaliation from gangs still at large. If the government can bring a war to our doorstep, one pastor said, what stops the criminals from bringing one back? As the headlines fade and new raids unfold in other cities, a haunting realization settles over Chicago. The ghosts behind the doors weren't just gang members. They were a mirror reflecting America's new face of law enforcement, swift, secretive, and silent. So the question remains, how do you fight monsters without becoming one yourself? The South Shore raid, as shocking as it appeared, was only the surface of something far greater, a national campaign that federal insiders called Operation Midway Blitz. It wasn't just about taking down a gang, it was about reclaiming America's streets from what officials described as foreign criminal infiltration. Behind closed doors in Washington, DHS briefings detailed a coordinated strategy that linked Chicago, Houston, and Miami into one synchronized federal battlefield. Reuters confirmed that Midway Blitz was greenlit in late 2024 under a new Homeland Security directive signed by President Trump, giving federal agencies expanded authority to operate across state lines when transnational gang activity is suspected. The result was unprecedented ICE, DEA, FBI, and the Department of Defense's intelligence branch began sharing real-time surveillance feeds and asset tracking systems once reserved for counter-terror operations overseas. In Chicago, that intelligence convergence culminated in the South Shore raid. According to Defense News, Midway Blitz took its name from the Second World War's pivotal naval battle, a nod to its strategy strike deep into enemy logistics before the adversary even knows it's been targeted. This wasn't metaphor. Analysts discovered that Trendiaragua's U.S. network relied heavily on cartel-linked shipping routes running through the Gulf of Mexico, piggybacking on legitimate trade. From ports in Galveston to warehouses in Illinois, the gang moved narcotics cash and people under layers of shell companies. The plan was simple in principle, but ruthless in execution, cut every artery feeding those networks. Within the first month of operations, DHS reported over 800 arrests nationwide, ranging from human smuggling coordinators to weapons traffickers tied to Venezuelan and Mexican syndicates. Chicago's South Shore was chosen not for symbolism, but necessity. It sat on a key junction for money transfers and safe house rotation. Strategically, Midway Blitz signaled a shift in U.S. law enforcement philosophy. As DW observed, the Department of Homeland Security was now treating organized crime as asymmetric warfare. That shift blurred traditional boundaries between domestic and foreign defense, a concept that Jane's Defense Weekly called the fourth front, where counter-terror, counter-narcotics, and immigration enforcement overlap. Across the globe, the trend mirrors how modern states adapt to hybrid threats. In Ukraine, Western intelligence supports Kyiv's deep strike drone tactics to decapitate command centers, precision warfare to destabilize networks. In Israel, the IDF's targeted operations in Rafah employ similar principles, disrupt logistics, seize communication nodes, neutralize leadership. And in East Asia, China has expanded its joint police patrols with neighboring states to combat what it calls trans-border criminal clusters. The United States, in essence, has brought that same global doctrine home. But strategy has a human cost. As The Guardian reported, residents of Chicago's South Shore were left with gutted apartments, demolished furniture, and unanswered questions. City officials scrambled to find temporary housing for families displaced during the raid. Local advocacy groups decried the lack of judicial oversight, warning that warfare logic applied to law enforcement risks eroding constitutional protections. For federal agencies, the optics didn't matter as much as the outcome. By August 2025, Midway Blitz had led to raids in 7 state seizures of more than $12 million in cash and 5 tons of narcotics. The White House hailed it as the most successful domestic interdiction in modern history. Critics, however, saw something else, a campaign redefining the boundary between liberty and control. And while America celebrated its victories, the world watched closely. European policymakers facing their own surge in gang violence from Balkan and African syndicates studied the US model with wary fascination. Could such overwhelming force be justified under democracy's watch? When the dust settles, history may judge Midway Blitz not by its numbers, but by its precedent. Has America, in defending itself from the enemy within, just built a battlefield where none should exist? By the time the footage from South Shore went viral, the political machinery in Washington had already begun shaping the narrative. President Donald Trump addressed the nation from the White House press room, standing before the flags of Homeland Security and the DEA. His tone was resolute, his message unmistakable. America will no longer tolerate terrorist cartels masquerading as migrant gangs. We will meet them with forced precision and total dominance. To his supporters, this was leadership in its purest form, decisive, unapologetic, patriotic. To his critics, it was a warning of how easily domestic policy could slide into militarized governance. The BBC noted that the Chicago operation had become a symbol of Trump's new internal security doctrine, blending counter-terror tools with border enforcement under a single strategic vision: treat transnational criminal groups as national security threats. Political analysts at The Guardian drew parallels to the Reagan-era war on drugs, but with a distinctly 21st century flavor: AI surveillance, predictive targeting, and the fusion of intelligence from military satellites to local precincts. Trump's administration argued this integration was necessary to keep pace with globalized crime syndicates that move faster than bureaucracy can. Yet civil rights advocates warned that unchecked power, even in the name of protection, could erode the very freedoms America was built on. Strategically, Washington's posture had shifted from defense to deterrence. As Defense News reported, the new doctrine called for visible supremacy. Large-scale operations meant not just to arrest, but to broadcast dominance. Helicopters, armored vehicles, drones, every tool of psychological warfare used abroad now had a domestic audience. The federal message was clear: the era of quiet enforcement was over. Across NATO circles, this transformation didn't go unnoticed. European defense think tanks cited by DW argued that America's internal crackdown could reshape Western doctrine itself, blurring military and law enforcement roles in countering non-state threats. What the US calls a gang one German analyst said the EU calls a hybrid actor, the concern that democracies might start treating crime as insurgency and dissent as potential terrorism. Globally, similar tactics are visible on every front. In Ukraine, US advisors helped refine Kiev's model of rapid urban infiltration, striking command centers before resistance can form. In Israel, preemptive raids in Gaza mirror the same philosophy of overwhelming force. And in China, state security justifies mass operations in Xinjiang under the rhetoric of prevention before danger. Chicago's South Shore, once just another American neighborhood, had become the proving ground for that global convergence of policing and war. Yet for all the political triumph, the human toll remained raw. Thousands of residents across federal raid zones live in fear of mistaken identity. A mother interviewed by Al Jazeera whispered, "They said they were after criminals, but they took my brother, he just worked nights." The administration's response was blunt: collateral disruption is the price of order. Trump's advisors defended the tactics as both moral and necessary, comparing them to US drone policies abroad, where precision comes at the expense of transparency. You can't dismantle an empire of violence with paperwork, one official told Reuters. But every empire, even the one built on law, risks forgetting its boundaries. As Chicago rebuilt and the media spotlight faded, a deeper question began to echo across the nation's conscience. When governments start waging wars within their own borders, can democracy still claim it's at peace? When the dust finally settled over South Shore, the silence was almost haunting. Police tape fluttered in the morning wind, the smell of burnt wiring still lingering inside the hollowed apartments. Families returned to find doors split open, baby cribs splintered, and walls scarred with breaching charges. The government called it a victory. The neighborhood called it something else: a wound. No list of detainees was ever released. No charges were confirmed. Reporters from Reuters and The Guardian filed multiple Freedom of Information requests, all denied under national security exemptions. The Department of Homeland Security insisted that revealing the names could compromise ongoing operations. In the absence of clarity, conspiracy rushed in to fill the void. Was this truly a strike against Tren de Aragua, or a wider sweep under the guise of counterterrorism? Federal briefings later admitted that not all 37 detainees were affiliated with the gang. Several were released within days, others transferred to undisclosed facilities in Texas and Arizona. To civil rights lawyers, this secrecy represented the new frontier of state power detention without disclosure, a line once crossed only in foreign wars. For residents, the aftermath was more immediate. Local schools turned into temporary shelters. City councilors reported dozens of displaced families, many too frightened to return home. "We were told this would make our community safer," said one South Shore teacher to DW. "But who's protecting us now?" Strategically, the silence served a purpose. As defense news analysts explained, opacity is part of the deterrence. Uncertainty breeds caution among enemies. If cartels or gang leaders cannot predict where the next strike will land, fear becomes its own weapon. Yet that same fear now rippled through American neighborhoods among the innocent as much as the guilty. Globally, Chicago's story resonates in every nation where the line between security and freedom is thinning. In Ukraine, occupied towns learn that liberation often feels indistinguishable from invasion. In Iran, anti-terror crackdowns blur into political suppression. And in China, the veil of secrecy around internal stability operations hides countless untold stories. Now, the United States, a nation that once condemned those tactics, was facing its own reflection. President Trump, in a late summer address, praised Operation Midway Blitz as a turning point in restoring American order. He vowed to expand it nationwide, targeting cartels and foreign gangs wherever they hide. Applause thundered in the briefing room, but beyond Washington, the questions grew louder. Al Jazeera highlighted the paradox: America's strength abroad had always depended on moral clarity. But what happens when that same force shadows its own citizens? By autumn, South Shore was rebuilding new paint over broken plaster, fresh locks on shattered doors. Yet the fear remained. Children flinched at sirens. Neighbors whispered about the night the helicopters came. The official record would one day mark the raid as a success. 37 arrests, no officer casualties, no shots fired. But success in this case came wrapped in silence. As the lights of Chicago glimmered across Lake Michigan, one question hung like fog over the city. When a democracy begins to fight its wars within, who keeps watch over the peace? The South Shore raid marked the dawn of a new era in American law enforcement. In 2025, under President Donald Trump, federal agencies launched Operation Midway Blitz, a nationwide offensive treating transnational gangs as terrorist entities. What began as a pre-dawn assault on a Chicago apartment complex soon exposed a global web of crime and politics. The Tren de Aragua gang, born in Venezuela, had embedded itself across U.S. cities, prompting a militarized response involving ICE, FBI, and Border Patrol units using war zone tactics. Yet victory came at a cost. Families displaced, civil liberties blurred, and federal silence deepened mistrust. International observers drew uneasy parallels with Ukraine's siege warfare, Israel's counter-terror raids, and China's domestic crackdowns, each echoing the same conflict between safety and freedom. Operation Midway Blitz achieved its mission, but left behind a nation questioning its soul. Was this the price of security or the first step toward a country at war with itself?